George's Secret Key to the Universe, Chapter 5. The room was getting darker and darker. "Come and sit here, George," called Annie, who had already settled herself onto the big comfy sofa. George sat down next to her, and after a few seconds, he saw a tiny beam of very bright white light. It came directly from Cosmo's screen. The beam shot out into the middle of the room, where it wavered for a second before it began to sketch a shape in the air. It moved from left to right in a straight line before drooping down toward the floor. Leaving a shining path of light behind it, it turned another corner to make 3 sides of a rectangle. One more right angle, and the beam of light came back into its starting point. For a second, it looked like a flat shape hanging in the air, but suddenly it turned into something very real and familiar. "But that looks like said George, who could suddenly see what it was. "A window," said Eric proudly. "Cosmo has made us a window to the universe. Watch closely." The beam of light disappeared, leaving the window it had drawn in the middle of Eric's room, hanging in mid-air. Although the outline was still shining with bright light, it now looked exactly like a real window. It had big sheets of glass in the pane and a metal frame. Beyond it, there was a view. And that view was not of Eric's house, or of any house, road, or town, or anywhere else that George had ever seen before. Instead, through the window, George could see an incredible, vast darkness, peppered with what looked like tiny, bright stars. He started to try and count them. "George," said Cosmos in his mechanical voice, "there are billions and billions of stars in the universe. Unless you are as smart as me, you will not be able to count them all." "Cosmos, why are there so many?" asked George in wonder. "New stars are created all the time," answered the great computer. "They are born in giant clouds of dust and gas. I am going to show you how it happens." "How long does it take for a star to be born?" George asked. "Tens of millions of years," replied Cosmos. "I hope you are not in a hurry." "Tut, tut," said Eric, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the sofa, his long, thin limbs bent at sharp angles. He looked like a friendly giant spider. "Don't worry, George. I've speeded it up quite a lot. You'll still get home for dinner. Annie, pass the chips around. I don't know about you, George, but the universe always makes me very hungry." "Oh dear," said Annie, sounding embarrassed. There was a rustling noise as she rooted around inside the big bag. "I better get some more." She leaped off the sofa and dashed back into the kitchen. As Annie left the room, George noticed something about the view through the window onto outer space. Not all of it was covered with little stars. In the bottom corner of the window, he saw a patch of total darkness, a place where not a single star shone. "What's happening there?" he pointed. "Let's have a look, shall we?" said Eric. He pressed the button on the remote control, and the view through the window seemed to zoom toward the dark patch. As they got closer, George realized that the enormous cloud was hovering in that spot. The window kept moving forward until they were right inside the cloud itself, and George could see it was made of gas and dust, just as Cosmos had said. "What is it?" he asked. "And where is it?" "It's a huge cloud in outer space, much bigger than the ones in the sky," replied Eric, "made up of tiny, tiny particles that are all floating around inside it. There are so many of these particles that the cloud is enormous. It's so big that you could put millions and millions of the Earths inside of it. From this cloud, many stars will be born." Inside the cloud, George could see the particles moving around, some joining together to form huge lumps of matter. These great lumps spun around and around, gathering even more particles all the time. But as the particles joined together, the spinning lumps weren't getting bigger. Instead, they seemed to be getting smaller, as though something was squeezing them. It looked like someone was making gigantic dough balls in outer space. One of these giant balls was quite close to the window now, and George could see it spinning around, getting smaller and smaller all the time. As it shrank, it became hotter and hotter, so hot that George could feel the heat from where he sat on the sofa. And then it started to glow with a dim but frightening light. "Why is it glowing?" asked George. "The more it shrinks," said Eric, "the hotter it gets. The hotter it gets, the brighter it shines. Very soon it's going to get too hot." He grabbed a couple of pairs of strange sunglasses from a pile of junk on the floor. "Wear these," he told George, putting a pair on himself. "It will soon be too bright for you to look at without glasses." Just as George put on the very dark glasses, the ball exploded from the inside, throwing off its outer layers of burning hot gas in all directions. After the explosion, the ball was shining like the sun. Wow, said George. Is that the sun? It could be, Eric replied. That's how stars are born, and the sun is a star. When a huge amount of gas and dust combines and shrinks to make dense and hot, as you've just seen, the particles in the middle of the ball are so pressed together that they start to fuse or join up, releasing an enormous amount of energy. This is called a nuclear fusion reaction. It is so powerful that when it starts, it throws off the outer layers of the ball, and the rest is transformed into a star. That's what you just saw. The star was now shining steadily in the distance. It was a beautiful sight. Without the special sunglasses, they wouldn't have been able to see much because the star was so bright. George gazed at it, amazed by its power. Every now and then he could see huge jets of brightly shining gases sent hundreds of thousands of miles from the surface at extraordinary speeds. And the star will keep on shining like this forever? He asked. Nothing is forever, George, said Eric. If stars shone forever, we wouldn't be here. Inside their bellies, stars transform small particles into larger ones. That is what a nuclear fusion reaction does. It fuses small particles together and builds big atoms out of small ones. The energy released by this fusion is enormous, and that's what makes stars shine. Almost all the elements that you and I are made of were built inside stars that existed long before the Earth. So you could say that we are all children of the stars. When they exploded a long time ago, these stars sent into outer space all these large atoms that they created. The same will happen to the star you and I are looking at right now, behind the window. It will explode at the end of its life, when there are no more small particles available to fuse into bigger ones. The explosion will send into outer space all the large atoms the star created in its belly. On the other side of the window, the star was looking angry. Its bright yellow color was turning reddish as it grew and grew, until it was so big that it almost was impossible to see anything through the window. It seemed to George that the star might explode at any moment. Eric pressed his remote control again, and the window immediately moved away from the star, which kept getting redder and bigger all the time. Isn't it amazing? Exclaimed Eric. At the first ball shrinks and gives birth to a star, and then the star gets to get bigger and bigger, and now is about to explode. Whatever you do, don't take off your glasses. George watched the star in fascination. Suddenly, long after it had reached a size no one could have imagined, the most powerful explosion George had ever seen happened just in front of him. The whole star blew up, sending into outer space enormous quantities of light and red-hot gas, including all the new atoms it had created. After the explosion, George saw that all that was left of the star was a beautiful new cloud, full of extraordinary colors and new materials. Ooh, he said. It was like watching the most incredible fireworks display. You see, said Eric, with time, the colorful cloud you see now will mix with other clouds, once far distant stars that have also exploded. As they cool down, all the gases from these clouds will mix together into an even bigger cloud, where stars will be born again. Near where these new stars appear, the leftover elements will gather to become objects of various sizes, but not ones big enough to become stars themselves. Some of these objects will become balls, and with time, these balls will turn into planets. In real life, it takes a very long time for all this to happen. Tens of millions of years. Wow! George was fascinated. But we haven't got that much time to wait, and you need to get home for your supper, said Eric, going over to Cosmos and pressing a few more keys. So let me speed it up a bit. Here we go. In the blink of an eye, the tens of millions of years Eric was talking about had passed. The gas from the explosion of dozens of stars had gathered into an immense cloud. Within this cloud, new stars were appearing everywhere, until one formed just in front of the window. That star's brightness made all the other stars very difficult to spot. Some distance away from this new star, the gas left over from the cloud was becoming very cold and had started to gather into small icy rocks. George saw that one of these rocks was headed straight for the window. He opened his mouth to warn Eric, but the rock was traveling far too quickly. Before George could say anything, it smashed into the glass with a shattering, splintering roar, and it seemed to shake the whole house. George jumped in fright and fell off the sofa. "What was that?" he shouted to Eric. "Oops," said Eric, who was typing away on Cosmos. "Sorry about that. I wasn't expecting to take a direct hit." "You should be more careful," said Cosmos crossly. "This isn't the first time we've had an accident." "What was it?" asked George, who found he was clutching a small teddy bear that Annie must have left on the sofa. He was feeling rather dizzy. "We were hit by a tiny comet," admitted Eric, who was looking a little sheepish. "Sorry, everyone. I didn't mean for that to happen." "A tiny what?" asked George, feeling the room spin around him. Eric typed a few more commands into Cosmos. "I think that's enough for today," he said. "Are you all right, George?" He took off his glasses and peered into George's face. "You look a little green." He sounded worried. "Oh dear, I thought this was going to be fun. Annie," he called into the kitchen, "can you bring George a glass of water? Oh dear, oh dear." Annie came in walking on tiptoe. She was carefully holding a very full teacup of water, some of which was sloshing over the side. Freddie the pig was glued to her side, casting adoring glances up at her with his piggy eyes. She held the cup out to George. "Don't worry," she said kindly. "I felt really sick too, my first time. Dad," it was a command, "it's time to let George go home now. He's had enough of the universe." Yes, I think you're right," said Eric, still looking concerned. "But it was so interesting," protested George. "Can't I see some more?" "No, really, I think that's enough," said Eric hurriedly, putting on a coat. "I'm going to walk you back to your house now. Cosmos, you're in charge of Annie for a couple minutes. Come on, George. Bring your pig." "Can I come back?" said George eagerly. Eric stopped fussing around with the coats and keys, outdoor shoes, and smiled. "Certainly," he said. "But you must promise not to tell anyone about Cosmos," Annie added. "Is it a secret?" asked George eagerly. "Yes," said Annie, "and it's a huge, great, big, ginormous, amazing secret that is a trillion gazillion times better than any secret you've ever heard before." "Now, Annie," said Eric sternly, "I've told you that gazillion is not a real number. Say goodbye to George and his pig." Annie waved and gave George a smile. "Goodbye, George," said Cosmo's voice. "Thank you for making use of my exceedingly powerful capacities." "Thank you, Cosmos," said George politely. With that, Eric ushered him and Freddie into the hallway and out of the front door and back to their real lives on planet Earth. Okay, we're going to take a minute to go back through the chapter so that we can read the informational part of this chapter. So the first one that I see is on page 47. Take a second to go back to page 47. So this little passage here is about particles. Elementary particles are the smallest possible things that cannot be divided up into smaller particles. Examples include the electron, which carries electricity, and the photon, which carries light. An atom is not an elementary particle because it is made up of electrons going around a nucleus in the center, like the planets that go around the sun. The nucleus is made of protons, and the neutron is packed tightly together. Protons and neutrons were previously thought to be elementary particles, but we know now they are made of smaller particles called quarks, held together by gluons, which are the particles of a strong force that acts on quarks, but not on electrons or photons. So the picture says a helium atom is 2 neutrons and 2 protons in the core, and 2 electrons circling around. So this is giving us some information about particles. Alright, so turn 2 more pages past where we just were, and you'll come to page 50, where it gives us a little information about matter. Matter is made up of atoms of various types. The type of atom, or element as it is called, is determined by the number of protons in the nucleus. This can be up to 118, with mostly an equal or greater number of neutrons. The simplest atom is hydrogen, whose nucleus contains just 1 proton and no neutron. The largest naturally occurring atom, uranium, has a nucleus that contains 92 protons and 146 neutrons. Scientists think that 90% of the total number of atoms in the universe are hydrogen atoms. The remaining 10% are all the 117 other atoms, in various proportions. Some are extremely rare. When atoms join together in chains, the resulting object is called a molecule. There are countless molecules of various sizes, and we build new ones all the time in laboratories. Before stars are born, only the simplest molecule can be found in space. The most common hydrogen molecule, which is inside the huge clouds of gas in outer space where stars are born. It consists of 2 hydrogen atoms joined together. So this is giving us some information about matter and then molecules and atoms that make up these clouds that George and Eric were talking about in the chapter.